Thanks for making it to the early session with us today. I know it's early, but the upside and the benefit of going right now is perspective. We heard a lot yesterday about 45Z, different policy issues, E15, California, maritime, and so now we get to kind of sit here and talk about what ethanol producers can do from a practical and a strategy standpoint. But one of the first kind of things I want to kind of set the stage for us, and I want you to pocket something. There's a book. It's called Through the Looking Glass, and it is a literary reference that turned into a biology reference that we can all apply to our businesses. So in the book, the Red Queen tells Alice that you have to run just to stay in the same place, and if you want to get anywhere, you have to run twice as fast. And then in biology, it's an organism has to do deliberate, high-effort change in order to be successful. And it's the same thing in our business. We have to do deliberate, high-effort, strategical changes in the industry in order to compete. And so I just wanted I want to pocket that as we go and speak to our guests. So over the last couple of days, we've heard about market volatility, policy uncertainty, and the pressure that ethanol producers are under kind of to remain competitive. And this session is about what we can do both practically and strategically. So with that, I would like to take some time and introduce the guests, and I'll have them introduce themselves, do a little tell us where you sit in the world, because we have folks that are kind of focused on energy and sequestration, and then also the direct usage of CO2. So Jack, I'll start with you. Tell us who you are and where you sit in the world.
Yeah, we'll start with a good morning again. Jack Roback, I'm the Director of Business Development for Antora. Antora, we make thermal batteries. Those thermal batteries make zero-emission steam and 15 to 30 points of CI reduction for a potential ethanol plant. I myself, chemical engineer, so a lot of the things we're talking about here are a lot of fun. Petchems, oil and gas, biofuels for BP, and actually helped start the EV charging business. So seeing a lot of different things, how to work with the utilities, how to work with grids. And yeah, excited for the discussion today.
Sylvain.
Good morning. So I'm Sylvain. I'm the CEO of Geostock. Geostock is a company that has been active for 60 years now. We started in the underground storage business for energy, natural gas storage, NGLs, propane, butane, hydrocarbons. We work and operate in about 50 countries, and the US are the second largest. And I'm here to discuss CO2, underground sequestration. We are the S part of the CCS world. The US are poised with a lot of storage capacity. You have the right rock formation, the right basin, and it's pretty close to where ethanol producers are. And we got a lot of clients that applied that, basically drilling wells, very deep wells, and injecting CO2 downhole for 10,000 years. So happy to be here and talk about all that.
Todd.
Thank you, Ted, for having me here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Todd Brix. I'm the CEO and co-founder of OCOchem. What we do is we convert CO2 into formate organic molecules, and we valorize that via using biogenic CO2, electricity, and water. Every carbon molecule that this audience has ever produced or consumed started as CO2. We've now developed a process to directly convert CO2 in probably the most energy effective molecule you can make from CO2 directly, which is formate. My background, I'm a chemical engineer. I worked for many years at Chevron, research and technology and hydrocarbon valorization and processing. Started with multiple different industrial software automation companies, and was involved in working on expanding embedded client industrial automation for Microsoft Corporation for many years before starting OCOchem. So very glad to be here today and look forward to talking to you more about how some of the CO2 resources this audience has can be valorized and turned into valuable added commodities that can be sold and monetized globally. Thank you.
Well, one more thing, Todd. You have a pilot plant in Richland, Washington. Tell us about that. How long that's been under operation and what it does in the industry for you.
Yeah, so we've constructed and finished last April the world's largest CO2 electrolyzer pilot plant, about 60 tons per year. We produce in that plant formic acid from biogenic CO2 from a local ethanol plant. This was the first product ever made from CO2 using our technology. This is the travel size version. But that pilot plant was commissioned and deployed 6 weeks after all the equipment was delivered. Our entire technology is modular. Our chemical plants are produced and assembled in factories, which are loaded up onto trucks, and then we just deploy modules one after another into our pilot plant, and had this first of a kind system deployed and operational 6 weeks from delivery. We had a facility structured where the equipment could be moved into, but this idea that we can modularly produce chemical plants rather than doing in-field builds dramatically lower the cost of the CapEx and dramatically accelerate the time to deployment of these types of systems. And so our system is modular in that way, but it's also modular in the cells that we use. So the core reactor technology that we have is an electrolyzer cell. Ours are the largest in the world at about 1.5 square meters. This is about 10 times the size of a typical hydrogen electrolyzer cell structure, and then we stack them together to increment any level of production that might be required on the system. The CO2 that we use at our pilot plant doesn't come right off of an ethanol stack. It actually goes through a liquefaction and transport process, but it's effectively entirely biogenic CO2 from a local ethanol plant, and we've been producing product now and shipping it and selling it commercially for the last 6 months.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to cover this in 3 areas, as you can see. We're going to reduce CI through energy and power strategies. We're going to talk about sequestration, and then we're also going to talk about opportunities for direct conversion. But I want to kind of ground in the policy backdrop. I know we've heard a lot about policy. We have received kind of some initial guidance on 44 or 45Z last month, but of course, not everything is finalized. We've heard a lot about that, but it's already influencing how producers are operating. A lot of the folks, again, going through the looking glass, they have already started on some of these things. I was wondering if you could each just kind of give a quick perspective on maybe 45Z or in your case, how you view that as an opportunity.
Yeah, I can start. There certainly are still a couple questions that are out there. Every time you have what is ultimately some legal document, there's going to be legal interpretation. But I think a lot of the questions generally for the industry, were addressed to a certain extent. Some of the specific ones, for us in terms of qualified facilities, RECs, a couple other things. There was some clarity provided there, and really allows everybody to feel a bit more confident, moving forward with whatever plan they have.
So when it comes to CCS and 45Q, 45Z, those are the 2 typical subsidies or tax credits that companies target. I would say, I'm not an expert in any of those. As mentioned, you really need to talk to an attorney to know exactly. But I'll say, you have an opportunity. As an ethanol producer, you can really leverage both options. Carbon capture and sequestration allow you to do that. You reduce your CI, and then you make the best bet from a strategic standpoint. What makes the most sense now based on the timing and your own calculation on economic benefits. But I'll use that as you have leverage, you have opportunity, you have a choice.
I'll be a little bit more specific. 45Q has been around since the late 2010s and has been increasingly increased, both for sequestration and utilization. Most of the customers and partners we work with focus on the 45Q utilization tax credit, which recently was equalized in the big, beautiful bill at $85 a ton. So we believe that it's easier to kind of convert CO2 on site into a chemical than it is to transport it somewhere to bury it. So that's kind of our position on 45Q. 45Z is a newer type of credit. There has been more clarity recently affixed to it, and it seems to be for many ethanol producers a little bit more valuable credit than 45Q, but that requires a level of sequestration, and there's a little bit more limited period of time and less bipartisan heritage for that over the last decade or so. I'd also say there's another credit that comes into play in the respect to our process, which is 45V. So we do two things simultaneously in our process. We, one, utilize CO2 and convert it into a beneficial use product, but we also produce hydrogen from water on the other side of the anode. So we can take advantage of both the 45V credit by producing green hydrogen and take advantage of 45Q, which is a CO2 utilization credit, which makes the credit stack a little bit more favorable, both for plant owners and operators.
Awesome. So with that, slight framing on where we sit, let's spend some time with Jack. Let's spend some time with you on the energy side. Let's talk about the thermal battery storage. Let's see it. Let's have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Todd was talking earlier, and he was saying modular.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, he's going to slide over here and talk about some of what I'm going to talk about, which is a good thing. So thermal batteries inherently, what we're actually doing, and we got a couple samples up here. So we take graphite, this little cube, hold in my hand.
Not to scale.
Not to scale. To scale. No. A good bit more than this. But we actually take this and we heat it up to almost 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. Pretty darn hot. And if you think about this, when you get this hot, there's two things that you could do. Is you could put a ton of insulation around it, and maybe when you really, really need power, open it up. Or you could say, I know that this is going to essentially radiate a certain amount of energy, and design something around it that just captures that all the time. So we've done the latter, purposely to pair it with industrial applications that are on all the time. So you can think we will charge or heat this graphite up a portion of the time, but it's always giving off heat. And actually, when it gets up to that 3,600, it's glowing white hot, kind of like a log in a fire when you see it. Very similar dynamic there. What that allows us to do is then take off that heat, capture it, and turn that into usable heat for industry. Biofuels is a key market for us, but increasingly turning to mining and consumer processed goods, CPG, and a couple other areas. So it's very exciting.
So we got an installation. It looks like it's someplace cold, and that's an ethanol plant.
Yeah. So this is we're commissioning this facility. You can actually see some of the batteries there themselves. So to what Todd was saying, so we'll make these in a factory in the U.S. We will then take them to the site. We bring in as many or as little as we need. We will actually pull some of that energy off. You can kind of see we have our main spine there. We'll send hot oil out. We'll take it back to a main utilities building where we'll generate steam. And then in terms of the interactions that we actually have with the facility, essentially we tap into the steam header and then take boiler feed water or condensate back. So pretty minimally invasive. We're able to set it up on the side, not create any additional downtime, and then provide reliable low CI steam from there. So it's really exciting. I was just up there last week.
Cold?
Yeah, it's cold. And just for scale, each one of those batteries is, let's say, 13 by 17 by like 12 feet high. So they can kind of look like little Lego blocks, but they're really big Lego blocks. It's really exciting, and we're looking to continue building the pipeline from here.
So we take electricity and we heat those boxes. There's an arbitrage or an exchange of RECs and off-peak electricity. Mm-hmm. And so how does that work? Like, what are we doing to lower CI via the Antora thermal battery system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So inherently the system, I kind of mentioned we only heat it a portion of the time, but it's giving off energy all the time. We charge roughly a third of the time. So think 8 hours. It also works a lot of the times. The cheap power is when you're sleeping. So just think 8 hours when you're sleeping. We're charging, but it's actually a multi-day battery. 3-4 days of duration. So pretty big step change from your traditional electrochemical systems that are out there. And what that allows us to do is actually capture low value electricity, but more importantly, to the conversation we had yesterday at lunch around AI and data and infrastructure, we are actually, since we have a very long duration to choose when we're going to charge, we present very minimal constraints to the grid. Actually, a lot of the time, we are just pushing more electrons through the grid when the grid was going to be underutilized anyways. So it's those two factors where we're able to capture very, very low value power, as well as really work with the electric grid to, in certain cases, assets that could have been producing, they're able to produce electrons then that never would have actually occurred. So trying to work with the system as opposed to against.
So it's, in a way, it's kind of a way for a producer to access off-peak electricity anytime, really.
Yeah, exactly. Off-peak, and then giving enough time so that, when the cold snap comes through for 3 days, that's totally fine. Yeah. Because you have a long enough duration to manage that.
So, so we talked about off-peak, but now let's have kind of a similar conversation with kind of renewable energy. So if you're from where I am, on a pleasant day, you'll be driving along the interstate, and only a few of maybe the windmills are turning. And somebody will ask you, how come they're not all turning? It's like, well, they don't need the power, right? And so there's excess, production capacity. And so how can ethanol producers access that?
Yeah, so that's exactly what we're trying to do. This is energy. A lot of us work in different parts of energy, and I've seen everyone has strong opinions about it. But take those wind farms, whether you like them or not. What usually most people say is, yeah, when I drive by it on a windy day and they're not spinning, I go, what the heck is going on here? It's kind of, so that's exactly what we're coming in to do. And you can think of those dynamics, especially across the middle of the country where all these ethanol plants are. When it's a windy day in Kansas, it's usually a windy day in Iowa and a windy day in Illinois and moving from there. So that just creates more electricity than can be used on a consistent basis. And
then to clarify, they do want them running.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Raise your hand if you built a $300 million facility and then are good with it being off 30% of the time.
Yeah.
No one's going to raise their hand. So yeah, it's coming in and just better utilizing those assets that are in the ground.
So how does that relationship with the utilities function? We have ethanol producers; they have a relationship with a utility. Now you do as well, through an installation. How does that work, kind of like structurally?
Yeah. So we will we will set up our own electrical infrastructure, ties to the grid, transmission infrastructure, all of that kind of stuff. And from the utility perspective, we're certainly a very large load. We're very different from, a data center that's coming in and asking for hundreds of megawatts all the time. And we're saying, hey, third of the time, we'll work with your system. We'll push more electrons through your existing assets. So the utilities, this is going to come as a shock to, I think, most people. They're slow moving.
Oh, really?
Yeah. However, especially as we have 1 and 2 and 3 to follow, once they then see it and they can kick it and poke it and just say, oh, okay, actually, yeah, you know what? We see how this is actually working and how we can use this, because ultimately they have the same constraints that a lot of us do, which is they want to get the best utilization of their system and provide the lowest cost. And increasingly so, given the conversation that's happening nationally, anything they can do to do that is extremely valuable to them.
Yeah. So then, from a deployment standpoint, obviously we have this. Where are we located? Where do we want to be located? What's in the pipeline today? So that's kind of a three-parter, right? And then what have you learned? Maybe the last piece is like, what have you learned from installations like this?
Yeah. So the facility is up there. It's in Midwest. It's an ethanol plant. We're continuing to build within the space. We also, will be pushing internationally. A lot of interest from some other markets. And Ted, I completely forgot the third part of your question there.
What have you learned from these?
Learn. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So
you got a few now, so.
Yeah. So it kind of again, going back to what Todd was saying, when you do something 10 times or 100 times, you start to get pretty good at it. But the whole point of this is when we do it 1,000 times and we build 1,000 batteries and we do this modular stack, that's when you really start, those lessons start to build and those cost profiles start to come down. So, I said I was there last week. There's a list of, 10 things that we've learned, and now, we're saying, okay, beautiful, like improve, and it just becomes this iterative process that allows the cost to come down, allows the reliability, all these different things to really come to be. So that's probably what is most exciting is, that aspect really coming to fruition and proving it in real time.
And then, so finally, kind of back to policy, you alluded to it a little bit, like how many CI points are we talking? What does it look like? Where do they come from? Let's have that.
Yeah, so we are focused on, obviously, the emissions that the plant will generate. So you can kind of see that highlighted in yellow. We're focused in that area. Really depends on your facility. Do you have gas dryers, steam dryers, your overall efficiency? But we say somewhere between 15 and 30 points of carbon intensity reduction. And when I think about just generally for the biofuels or ethanol, industry, I hold kind of three buckets, and we got a couple folks here that are addressing some others. We're focused on the in-plant. There's obviously the farm. There's a lot of great things going on there, and then everything that we're talking about here. Then there's still all of the CCS or CO2 utilization and everything that can come there. So that farm, that in-plant, and then the CO2 utilization. I mean, they all fit together. And I myself am very excited, especially being someone from the West, wife from the West. There's going to be some pretty economical, I think, zero or negative CI ethanol pretty darn soon.
Amen. Let's move on to Sylvain. Let's talk about sequestration. We've talked about it a lot in the past. Now, for ethanol producers, it could be a potentially large CI lever when we have that conversation, but also a little bit of a complex one, depending on the direction. So often, and I've done this as well as I've discussed kind of the map of where the geology sits. And, we kind of look at that, and it shows the sequestration potential. How do we know the accuracy of that? Because, it's a big area. Some of it's explored, some of it's not. Have we really in the United States drilled enough wells to actually know? And so kind of walk us through that and how it's a geology question.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. If we can, so this little map here of the U.S. is a few colors, but to answer briefly, the answer is yes. I mean, the U.S. have been drilled many times by the oil and gas industry for about a century. Millions of wells across the U.S. have been drilled deep enough to know where potential sequestration can happen. So that little map here is a helicopter view or a satellite view, I should say, of where sedimentary basins in the U.S. are located in blue. They are not everywhere. That's clear.
They're not where they should be.
Yeah, well, in some parts of the Midwest, the geology is not really designed for underground sequestration. So it's kind of the way we look at it. It's very quick and easy to say where it doesn't work. Again, there are many wells that have sampled those regions and those rock formations. But when it works, or it might work, you still need to do a little bit of work to assess the quality of the rock formation. We're looking at burial, the depth between the rock, between the surface and where you will inject. And you need roughly 6,000 to 10,000 feet of formation. We will need to look at potential, stratigraphy and potential faults in the area, which are very important. But one message is it's not rocket science. I mean, this has been applied by the oil and gas industry for more than a century. This is a very old technology. It's been proven, to your point, thousands and thousands of times. But it requires a specific approach to CO2 sequestration, that's all.
Yeah. So when we see these maps on kind of suspected geology, we can be pretty confident in some of these things. Now, I got to ask, how likely is it that there's maybe some additional, untapped or sequestration potential, in the Midwest?
Yeah.
Specifically where your map says it's not.
This map illustrates where the little red and blue dots illustrate where we have drilled wells, class 6 wells, meaning wells that currently inject CO2 for ethanol producers, or stratigraphic test wells that you need to do ahead of the injection itself. You always need to do that as per EPA, or even state regulators will always require you to drill a well at the very beginning. To answer your question on are there places where you could potentially find untapped resources, you always start with a feasibility study. It's not super expensive, but basically you're asking a geologist like myself to take a quick look at the data around your plant and say, okay, could it work? And that's not too pricey. I would say the likely scenario, though, is if you're in a place where there is no solution underground, you have to move on to joint venture, to collaboration, to people in the room that may have a solution 200, 500 miles from your plant, and then you collaborate. You bring the CO2 from where you are to where they are, and you inject over there. You don't always need a pipeline to do that. There has been a lot of conversation. I have many friends that work in the midstream industry. I worked in the midstream industry. It is difficult to have right-of-ways and approvals to lay a pipe. But you can use trucks, you can use rail. A lot of companies are providing those services. And for a certain distance, I would say 250 miles, 500 miles, it is still applicable. The cost is still manageable.
So that's an interesting point. And when we were first talking, that, I guess I'll call it a co-op model.
Yep.
That could be a viable alternative to a pipeline for a lot of folks. One of the issues would be, it's 15 trucks a day. But for the most part, that kind of hub and spoke opportunity could be something that a number of ethanol plants could kind of get together, sink a well somewhere within a viable transportation range, and then either rail or, of course, truck it to an injection point and be able to take advantage of it that way.
Correct. One important aspect is scale. To give some numbers, it works if you have roughly 150,000 tons per year of CO2 or more. So if you have less than that, the chances are the scale, the cost to drill those wells, you'll not make money. So 150, 200,000 tons, to your point earlier on, with an $85 per ton of 45Q, that gives you roughly $15 to $20 million a year. So, $1.5 million a month. That's the idea of what you need to generate. So if you're two ethanol producers and both of you produce 75,000 tons a year, and one of you doesn't have the solution underground, but the other one, 500 miles south of you has, well, you need to work together, and then you have a solution. And that's the idea of that. Ideally, you drill underground on your land, around your ethanol plant. For sure, that's the best solution. You're really going to make a significant cost reduction applying that locally. Plus, you avoid all the logistical hurdles of moving things around. But as an ethanol producer, you already know how to manage, trucking, railing, all that. The logistic behind is not complex. It's just an additional stream to manage.
Yeah. So let's talk about cost and timelines, right? We've all heard what some of these things cost. We've kind of seen, and I kind of monitor the DOE website on applications, and somebody's waiting for something on every one of those statuses. And so what are typical costs associated with it? What does it look like? Walk us through that.
So, and I would say we know. So when you make a decision like that, like in investing a significant amount of money, what's important is to know the risks. So, and the classics, or I would say underground storage for CO2 has been their risk. You pretty much know what you end up with. So basically, the day you make a decision to do that, you'll need about 4 years from that decision to the day you inject CO2. The first year, it's about feasibility study and drilling a stratigraphic test well. The permit for a strat test well is not complex. It doesn't take too long. You drill that well for the first year. A well like that, depending on the depth, it's anywhere between $3 and $7 million, give or take. This is an amount of money that you keep because you'll use that well as a monitoring well down the road. So it's not money that's wasted, that's lost. It's just money that you have to spend on year one. Then you run through the Class 6 permitting process or the state-regulated process if the state has primacy, but it's the same concept. That process is typically 2 years. It takes about 6 months to build the file, and then about 2 years for the EPA, let's say, to analyze. Why is it so long? Well, because you're demonstrating two things. You're demonstrating to the EPA that, and that's the little graph here, the underground source of drinking water, the USDW, will not be contaminated. That's the first major hurdle you're trying to demonstrate. It's not trying, you must demonstrate. The second one is no induced seismicity. So when you drill and you inject, 6,000 feet or below, you have to demonstrate that your flow, your pressure will not frack the formation, that no induced seismicity will be impacted. And the additional burden is you have to demonstrate that the CO2 that you inject will stay there for 10,000 years. And we model that through time, and we are capable of telling, yes, it will stay there for 10,000 years. It seems like a very long time, but bear in mind that oil and gas have been stored underground for hundreds of millions of years. So for Earth, it's nothing. Yeah. The real challenge is drilling the well. In other words, the geology is strong enough to sustain CO2. This is never the problem. The CO2 will never leak throughout 6,000 feet of formation if you do the right. That risk does not exist. The risk is on drilling the well itself. How do you drill it? What are the technology you apply? And again, this has been known. This is proven. CO2 is very corrosive, so you have to use corrosion-resistant alloys, your casing, your cement, which are available on the shelf. It's a technology which exists. And once you do that and you've drilled, then this is it. And the EPA has approved your permit after 2 years, so you're year 4 now or year 3. Then you start drilling your wells, typically 1 or 2 wells. You don't need more than that. And those wells are roughly, a little bit more than the stratigraphic test well, maybe, $5 to $10 million each. Again, it depends on on how deep you are. On top of that, you need to add compression and dehydration on surface. Those are the 2 things you need. One point which is important and that we're all using, the CO2 that's produced by the ethanol process is super clean. You don't need to do anything. It's just pure CO2. You just have a little bit of water and you need to put it at a pressure which it becomes supercritical. That's really, really interesting. Bear in mind that the 45Q were designed primarily for oil and gas purposes, which have a very, very high cost to clean the CO2. So the ethanol industry is, you can reap the benefits without a lot of investment, which is a good place to be, a really good place to be. So 4 years, and about $25, $30 million plus the surface facilities. So you're talking about overall maybe $50, $60 million over 4 years to build, drill, get the approvals, and get a solution for talking about numbers. This will apply and work for 25 to 40 years. So you add something that's equivalent to your ethanol plant itself. Okay, it's that long. And then the operations and maintenance are fairly minimal. Once the well is drilled, you need to make sure, which we do that as well, you need to make sure that the well maintains its integrity. You test that every year, but it stays there. As an oil producer, an oil well can be there for 80 years, 90 years.
Yeah. When you mention 10,000 years, you always hear well, how do you know? It's like, well, one, geologic time just works from a different perspective, right?
Yeah. No, without being too nerdy, I mean, you have pretty cool models to model the dynamic flow in a rock formation between water, and it's a fun little thing. But you also do monitoring. You do surface monitoring. You make sure that the CO2 plume is monitored, that it goes at the pace it's supposed to do, and you measure that throughout the life of the project.
So, last kind of clarification question: when we see these Class 6 well permitting processes, everything that goes into it, it may be kind of linear in what needs to happen and in what order. Where did the projects kind of typically stall, and then what's getting worse? What's getting better in that process?
So the short answer, unfortunately, is it depends. The EPA started this process in the 70s with Class 1 wells, wastewater well. Geostock started in the US with Class 1 wastewater well, which is an exact replica of the Class 6 permitting is an exact replica of a Class 1 permit. Can you make sure that the water you inject downhole will stay there? And regulators can be very picky. They have specific ways of looking at it. They have, when you file for a permit like that, you will end up with NODs, notice of deficiencies, that are questions that a regulator will ask you that you did not clarify well enough. I would say that what I have seen so far is, if you're coming from, it depends where you're coming from. If you're coming from an oil and gas industry background, which is my case, you're not used to that high level of scrutiny from a regulator. Filing for an oil and gas well is 30 days, not 2 years. And what we've seen is a lot of people that wanted to get into that space with that mindset failed, because they thought, oh, this is easy. I've applied for wells. I mean, it's nothing. Well, it is something. Again, you have to prove that the thing you inject will stay down there, instead of the opposite. Pumping something off the ground doesn't require a lot of, validation. And so we've seen a lot of mistakes from people that never had to go through a Class 1 or a Class 6 permit. We've done that for 30 years. So I'm not selling something too complex, but you have to know what you do, and you have a way of getting the approval done. And I feel it's a lot of the problems that regulators face is, well, this is not, your permit is not addressing the questions we're asking.
Okay.
So, do it again.
Right. Thanks for that. That was wonderful perspective. Todd, let's have a chemistry talk now. I mean, it's the morning, the third day. Let's talk about chemistry.
Well, we all love our high school chemistry courses, like fond memories. Right?
Yeah. So Todd, explain hydrogen formate, formic acid, potassium formate, what it's used for.
Yeah.
Do with that.
So we started this on a first principles basis, basic stoichiometry. What's the least energy required to take CO2 and turn it into a liquid, useful organic molecule? That molecule is called formic acid, and it's a very simple formula. You take 2 hydrogens from water, H2O, right? Take the 2 hydrogens, and you chemically bond them to carbon dioxide, which is a carbon plus 2 oxygens, both connected with double bonds. So you're just breaking 2 of those double bonds, and you're adding a hydrogen to the oxygen, you're adding a hydrogen to the carbon. And so that is the least amount of energy you can put into any molecule of CO2 and get a useful organic molecule out. If you compare that with something like making jet fuel, ethylene, methanol, it's about 20 times less electricity per molecule to get into a useful state.
And that's an important aspect, because remember, when we talk about chemistry, those double bonds, are always kind of an issue, and then also, adding molecules or atoms to it to make a larger molecule.
That's right. So CO2 is like the worst thing to work with, frankly, from a chemical perspective, because it's the most oxidized state of carbon, just like water is the most oxidized state of hydrogen, right? And so you have to put energy into it to get something useful back out. Now, photosynthesis is remarkable. Photosynthesis has figured out a way to go do that. But if we were going to use it using modern 21st century technologies, you got to put energy input into it, either heat or electricity. We use mostly electricity to go do that, and we make the most efficient molecule that can be made. Now, what is formate used for? It's used entirely or almost predominantly in our food and feed security system on the planet. Okay, So every feed ingredient that feeds a pig, a cow, or a chicken has formate or formic acid in it, primarily as a silage preservative, as a feed preservative. The U.S. doesn't make much of this anymore, so we import almost all of it from China and Germany, but it's critical to our food and feed supply system. If we like pollinators that fertilize our flower-bearing crops, almost all those bees now are protected from the varroa mite and the viruses those are infected for by formic acid. And then, there's 10,000 different industrial and solvent uses. If you've ever taken a vaccine or used a pharmaceutical, formic acid is what inhibits bacterial growth in those types of markets. And so it's pretty essential to the food and feed security system of the world, second only to ammonia in terms of our ability to feed our domestic animals and humankind.
Let's look at it also from, you and I have talked in the past about electron carriers, right? Mm-hmm. So, hydrogen, we transport it, ammonia we transport, CO2 we can do that. But for specifically hydrogen, it's a very, very small molecule. Yep. Seals don't work great. It likes to escape and do whatever. But if you can take something and turning it into a liquid and something that's in a more stable form and then transport it long distances, and in chemistry, if you can go forward, you can go backward. Mm-hmm. So explain that process.
Yeah, so moving a liquid around in a tanker car costs about 1/10 the cost of moving a compressed gas. Just general rule of thumb. Hydrogen is more complicated because hydrogen likes to embrittle steel and leaks like a sieve everywhere. But even CO2 in a liquefied form or a compressed form, this is much more expensive equipment. You have a pressurized system. There's DOT limitations on how big of a tanker car you can go move. And so one of the applications that we've worked on with a number of companies across the planet is to use formate as a liquid carrier of hydrogen. And this is specifically for two type classes of companies. Companies that want hydrogen or companies that want to move and transport CO2. And so one of our major investors is a leading Japanese oil and gas company. What they want to do is to transport CO2 in the liquid carrier form of formate, and then inject the CO2 into a well. But before they do that, they want to get the hydrogen out, and that pays for the whole thing, right? Because the green hydrogen is worth $10,000 a ton. The CO2 is worth like $20 a ton, right? And so, but then the transport cost gets reduced by 90% by moving it like as liquid formate, and they can move it anywhere in the world through super tanker cars. And so hydrogen formate, not only a hydrogen carrier but a CO2 carrier for the same purposes of ultimate sequestration. But you get the hydrogen back to pay for the whole thing.
Yeah, I always think that's a super interesting concept. So recently, you had announced that you have a project with ADM.
Yep.
Tell us about that. How did it come to fruition, and what are your goals for it?
Yeah. So back in August, we announced a first commercial plant production opportunity with Archer-Daniels Midland. Archer-Daniels Midland operates a large ethanol refinery in Decatur, Illinois, and they're blessed with on-site sequestration. I think they sequester per EPA almost 1 million tons a year, and it's just right underneath the plant. So they're super fortunate.
Good for them.
Good for them. They sited the plant unknown to them, years before they knew that there was a great CO2 sequestration. But what we did together is they said, we are interested in figuring out ways of valorizing our CO2. Half of the carbon that we harvest and pay for in the form of corn comes into our plant and goes out our smokestack through fermentation. Half of the carbon we just paid for in corn goes out of the flue stack. We would like to figure out a way to make money out of that CO2 beyond just credits by turning it into a value-added chemical that we can use across our bioproducts product line, and to be able to add additional revenue streams based on our ethanol. This is no different than probably some of the considerations that most of this audience has as well. And they said, we think your technology is important. We think it needs to get scaled up, and we'd like to help support you do that. And so right now, we're going through a rapid process of FID, from design start to FID, 6 months. from FID to factory deployment at 10,000 tons per year, 12 months. Permitting, 6 months. And then we'll have an operational 10,000 ton per year facility, at Archer Daniel Midland site that we can demonstrate for them and the world and the entire ethanol industry, which is how we can take CO2 and turn it into products that are worth not 10 times as much, 100 times as much as the value of CO2 if you were just going to do standard food and beverage grade, CO2 to the general industry.
That's exciting. That's exciting. So beyond ADM, you mentioned that there's some other opportunities that you have pursued and maybe some additional investors. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we're CO2 agnostic. We love bio-CO2 for the reasons Sylvain said, which is 99.3% pure. You got some VOCs and oxygen you got to get off, but it's good stuff, right? It's the best CO2 on the planet.
We often say that if you can't do it with CO2 from an ethanol plant, you can't do it.
Right. That said, though, almost every industrial facility in the world uses some form of fossil fuels and therefore generates some amount of CO2. And so there was a slide put up about the CI score. Well, yes, if you can take that biogenic CO2 and sequester it or utilize it, that could lower your CI score by 20, 25 points. But there's all this other CO2 ethanol plants are typically emitting as well, primarily from dryers and boilers burning natural gas, right? If you could capture that CO2 as well and purify it and clean that up, then you've just doubled your CO2 output and your CI score goes from 50 to 10, right? Because the CO2 footprint of a bioethanol plant is not just biogenic CO2, it's all these other combusted natural gas that you need to operate the dryers and the boilers. And so capturing CO2 from a less pure source like post-flue gas combustion CO2 is more expensive than biogenic CO2. But if you can do it for like $50 a ton and make a product that's worth $500 a ton and double the CI score value of your 45Z type of credit, that usually pencils out.
Yeah. That's a good kind of lead in. So, one of the questions that I'm sure everybody has, when we look at formate-based chemicals, versus traditional petrochemical options, how does the formate from the OCO process stack up? Is it at parity, cost parity? Certainly CI benefit, but how does that work?
Yeah, so not surprisingly, in the formate that we make, because it's from CO2, is a lot cheaper of a feedstock than starting from coal or natural gas on a fossil fuel type of basis. So we don't have that cost in our process. We do have electricity, though, as a cost, but when you compare our cost to the leading Chinese producer on the planet, which operates the largest scale plants, we are at cost parity with that producer today, even at a very small scale. Relative to Western producers, we are about 38% cheaper on a per unit cost basis by using CO2. So we will be the low-cost leader. There's no green premium. There's a green discount for what we're producing today. And we think that helps expand the market relative to petrochemicals. And so in the world today, people are much more conscious of eating fossil fuels for breakfast or for dinner or for lunch. Okay, people are against that. However, if you can replace those petrochemical-based feed ingredients with formate-based feed ingredients, we are therefore, USDA organic certified, right, from the process that we operate. And so all of a sudden, you can see a dramatic replacement, and this has already happened, in the feed ingredient industry. The U.S. now is almost on the verge of banning formaldehyde use finally in our feed process, right? So that's been banned everywhere else in the world except the U.S. and China. And now we're the EPA under the current administration that started in the previous administration says, we really don't want carcinogens anymore that we're feeding our cows and our chickens and our pigs. And so EPA had a ruling in December, and so maybe we'll catch up with the rest of the world and stop putting as many fossil fuels, into our diet.
Awesome.
And that's what formate made from biogenic CO2, made from ethanol plants, allows us to go do.
Yeah, thanks for that. So to kind of close this out, I just want to underline a couple of key points. So ethanol plants, we know have been converting carbon their entire lives. What changed is, policy alignment, technology maturity, and then kind of market willingness to kind of pay for those low CI molecules or opportunities. Whether it's power strategies or sequestration or direct utilization, the common thread here is optionality, right? So 45Z has given a lot of folks the opportunity to take a look at, where they sit in the world, where they sit geographically, and then how it fits into their business, power purchase agreements, those kinds of things. I would just like to take the last few minutes here and just do some key takeaways, what we'd like to see in the future, and close us out.
Yeah, great question. So I'll touch on what you said with 45Z. It's technology neutral. Something that this room has been harping on for a long time is, hey, if you can do something, set a target, set a goal, and go after it. There's a lot of options that are out there. I myself, I said I get very excited about where this can all go. You stack a couple of these things together, you get some very low CI products.
And I think we're going to see that, right?
Yeah.
We're going to see multiple technologies get stacked.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the other aspect is, obviously E15. Hopefully they'll be coming other markets. But as a lot of these plants, continue to expand, how some of these solutions fit immediately in to those, I think is extremely valuable. And some of us, something that often can stop an expansion is air permits or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? If you're using a zero emission electricity, you don't have that.
It's someone else's air permit.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm very excited. The technology neutral aspect of it, it's whatever works. And each, it's going to be a combination. It's going to be a mix at all these different places.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
Sylvain.
No, I like your point about being flexible and opportunistic. I'm sorry. It's not just about selling ethanol in the U.S. There were a lot of conversation yesterday about how global the market is. There is a global appetite for low carbon or low greenhouse gas emission processes, whether you're in Europe or elsewhere in the world. If you're capable of targeting those kind of markets early on, you have a competitive edge. And in the U.S., back to carbon sequestration, the policies are here to help us. Yes, it's slow. 4 years is nerve-wracking. I still don't know why it takes so long. But at the end of the day, there is a way to do it. In other parts of the world, in Europe, you cannot do carbon sequestration. It's capped at 400 tons per year on some countries, like France, for example. So you don't have that option as a producer. Here you can. So do that, and then ride the policies the way they are. But more importantly, target the markets that will give you a premium for that. And it's out there, not just in the U.S.
Todd.
Yeah. So North America has 220 biorefineries. The primary product they've been making for the last 20 years is a single product, ethanol, which has a blend wall cap and has a long-term trajectory that's going to be pretty much consistent with what the gasoline markets will demand. And so the opportunity that was always there for every biorefinery in the United States is even more realistic today than it was before, which is to valorize co-products from the production of ethanol to create value-added products that create local employment, that increase the demand for corn, and produce products progressively less and less expensively than their fossil-based counterparts, right? And the fastest, and we think the most profound way to do this and to fully take advantage of the credit structures that are now in place in the United States is to use, not bury, and not waste the biogenic CO2, which is one of the most greatest resources that the bioethanol industry has today, and can valorize to not only augment and make our fuel supply more secure and efficient, but to create a wide variety of other types of organic, premium value products at a lower cost than the petrochemical-based pathways that exist today. And OCOchem was designed and built to make that happen and to partner with every single one of the companies who produce ethanol in the United States. We have 80 million tons of biogenic CO2 from bioethanol companies. That's less than 5% of the entire organic chemical market globally, and we can be a leader of that in the United States for every single ethanol refinery, both satisfying domestic demand and much of our allies and friends' demand for these organic chemicals as well.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys' time. Thanks for looking through the looking glass, and just remember, we'll bring it back to the beginning. We got to run twice as fast to get anywhere, and I think some of these policy and these technologies are a way to get us some momentum and some movement. So, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right.
This is cool. It's a cool thing.